Hello and welcome. My name is Tracy with ABC Success. I would like to thank you for taking the time to attend the webinar today on the topic of turning performance history into a plan for success. This is the sixth in a series of Avamark webinars this year, and we are pleased you could join in. A few reminders before we get started. Everyone's audio has been set to mute to keep down background noise. Please submit questions or comments using the questions box. We will save some time at the end of the presentation today to answer any questions submitted. The presentation is being recorded and will be sent to you following the webinar. Feel free to share this link with others in your practice who are unable to attend today. Our speakers today are Kim Fish and Scott Anderson with ABC Success. At this time, I would like to turn over the webinar presentation to Kim.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And like Tracy said, you will all get a copy of this webinar so you can spend some time going back through some of the slides that we'll be going over. And Scott and I will primarily be leading this webinar today, but we do have Dr. Mel Paquin on with us also as part of our team, and you may occasionally hear in from Julie Donovan or Robert Olivas as well. But we're coming together to show you basically what it is that we do with our clients and our potential clients to get baseline metrics on what's been happening at the practice, and also get a better understanding of how your protocols might be impacting the results that you're getting. So there's a component of history in there, and then there's also what we call the plan for success we'll be talking about today. So there is a document that hopefully you can upload if technology permits. If you can't get it, just let us know. We will send you a copy of this PDF, but basically this is the guide to the webinar today, so you know the different components that we're going to be covering in our example of the exploratory analysis. So while you might be accessing that, Scott's going to speak on part of our theme for today, and then we'll go ahead and get into the webinar. Scott?
Okay, great. Thank you, Kim, and thank you for everyone who's attending. And the key thing we're focusing on today is, that is how we're going to build our practices, become more profitable, or in the worst case, at least viable. And there are several practices out in the industry, as Dr. Paquin and Kim and I have seen, that aren't very viable in terms of sustainability, and so what we want to do is to give you ideas as far as things you should be looking at and doing for your practice. Now, what's on this screen, and I'm not going to repeat everything, that what we're trying to do is to encourage you to use the information from your Avamark system to analyze your past. And analyzing what's happened to you in the past gives you the opportunity to be able to decide what you're going to do in the future. And so if you do nothing, history will repeat itself, whether you have fluctuations, as you'll see later in the presentation, regarding number of invoices, the average transaction. If you just sit back and let everything happen to you, that history will repeat itself, whether that's good or that's bad. But you need to be aware of it for planning purposes. You need to be aware of it in terms of if in the summer months, if you're in an area where seasonally your revenue goes up a lot, you have to be able to anticipate that increase and the needs as far as staffing, as far as doctors, and or if in the winter it goes down, and number 4 here, you've got to be able to anticipate what's coming in order to manage expenses. And I put in quotes guarantee, nothing's guaranteed really, but you've got to keep your practice viable and healthy. And so what we're going to go through today is what number 5, management, owners, managers, need to look at in order to analyze what's happened and make a change going forward. Kim?
Okay, thanks. And I don't know, Dr. Paquin, if you had anything that you wanted to contribute. if we can.
Not necessarily at this time. It's just really emphasizing just kind of looking at the practice kind of from a global perspective on this, and then we can, once we look at these, then we can dial in the specifics on how to increase ACT or revenue growth, et cetera. So.
Yeah, great point. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so as you know from the introduction that you responded to when you registered for the webinar, the focus is on the exploratory analysis. So in here, some of what we'll be doing is using your Avamark reports. So we'll talk briefly about that. We'll have a list of some of the reports that you'll want to be able to pull to go through these steps. But we'll be doing things like looking at how categories and the treatment items within those categories are related to each other. And definitely there's the component of history, turning into real-time planning and monitoring, and the whole process is really meant to help drive your medical production as well. So in the course here with history, we're going to go through and we're going to look at key indicators like your revenue and what makes up the revenue, your transactions and the average charge per transaction, we call it the ACT. We'll also be looking at new clients because that's important to kind of counter natural attrition that happens as well. And then we'll also be looking at how when you monitor revenue and frequency of use of your different codes, that's really important for trying to analyze what works, what doesn't work, what needs some attention so you can create that plan for success. And then it's so important to be monitoring in real time, not just look at everything historical, because when you're in real time, that's when you can actually make adjustments and make sure that the plan works. And by the way, there's a little tiny word in the middle of my screen in case it's showing up on yours. I apologize. It's going to be on every screen. I can't get rid of it, but hopefully it won't distract us and we can continue through here. Scott's going to briefly go through some of the reports that we use. So as we explain the steps that we recommend for doing an exploratory analysis, you can refer to this list then for the reports that can actually convert to these charts and analytic that we will demonstrate for you today. Scott?
Great. Our practice management systems, Avamark, every other system out there, can generate a lot of reports. Okay, it's capable of slicing and dicing things any way we want. But the key things, that if you want to make a change in your practice and you want to analyze your practice, Kim will show you later how when we do an exploratory analysis, we analyze the last 3 years to see what month-to-month trends are, what seasonal trends are, that kind of thing, and then we forecast what the future might look like if you didn't make a change. But one of the key things, and I was on a consultation with a client this morning who said, what can I do today? And as Dr. Paquin would probably say, it's a combination of the number of transactions and the average charge per transaction. And a good thing to do is, in the exploratory, we cover a lengthy period of time, which frankly, in my own practice, I wouldn't expect them to do because it takes a lot of time. But the treatment list up at the top here, okay, is important because how do you structure your fees? Okay, and is it appropriate? And we evaluate that. But down toward the bottom of the list here, the transaction journal, we look at each of these things you see, and we use these reports from Avamark to be able to analyze a practice's history, where they're headed, what we're going to do. But kind of it boils down to the transaction journal in that, and in most of your Avamark systems, the transaction journal is set to automatically print at the end of the day. So today it printed for yesterday. And if you simply, scan down through that and, and to the extent of taking the list, and Scott Anderson came in just to get a refill on a medication or a diet, but if you looked at the transaction journal and you brought up my record of me and my pets, that it gives you the chance to evaluate, did we do everything we could do in terms of the pet that was presented? Okay, so if Dr. Paquin was seeing my dog and me, and I said, and he recommended and justified laboratory, and I said, Doc, I can't afford that right now, that every event should trigger the next event. And so the transaction journal gives you the chance to evaluate what you did in particular cases and what you could have done. So if you looked at my record, I was in because my dog was vomiting. Dr. Paquin suggested certain things, scheduled a recheck, which we'll get back to that. But that to examine yourself, do a self-diagnosis, is extremely important in terms of what did we do, what could we have done. And I have confidence in Dr. Paquin and virtually every veterinarian I've ever had associations with of doing the right thing in the care of the patient. But as far as the care of the business, that's what we'll be addressing somewhat today. So with that said, Kim, I will well, and this gets to that point, self-inquiry. We, in the exploratory analysis, which you'll get a copy of how we do it, so you could do it for yourself, if that's time efficient for your practice. But, the strengths and weaknesses, like I said, transaction journal, what did you do? So, Kim, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that we do with our practices when we go through the exploratory analysis with them is we give a questionnaire that addresses these different topics here. So what you want to do is investigate for yourself too about, what are the things that you see as being your strengths and your weaknesses? What are your areas of concerns? What is it that you want to create for goals for yourself going forward? Look at the impact that your staff has, the pros and cons, including staff compliance and staff protocols, or the protocols even developed. Okay, reminders is a big topic we're going to be talking about today. What are your protocols in there? Because that covers a lot of things, from setup to how you manage the reminders in the pet records to even how you process the reminders. We'll even be talking about fee structure. So, how did you get to the fees that you have and how are they working for you? And then there's things like cash flow, and do you review your P&L statement, and how's your revenue, working out for you? So these are the types of questions that you want to really look at for yourself, just like we would for our clients when we're doing an exploratory analysis. So after that, we're going to get into now the charting of that data. Like Scott said, we like to look at 3+ years. So if we did an exploratory analysis for you now, we would probably do 2012 on through today. So you'd get about 3.5 years of charting. And it's really important to be able to see trends like that. I was just talking to a doctor this morning about it because she had something happen in the last few years. So it helps to create kind of some evidence of how did it used to look, and what happened, when did it happen, and where is she at today getting there. So looking at this history can be very informative. And I know in Avamark it's a lot of reports you have to pull every single month going back for those 36+ months. That's where you may opt to have us help you with that, because it is so much time that it can take to pull the reports. But when you get them, you can convert them into Excel and then chart them. And the first chart that we want to create is one based on revenue. We just put everything into a table. We kind of recreate it, assemble the data that we want, and charts can come off of that in Excel. But basically, when we chart out the revenue, and again, you're going to get a copy of this so you can spend some time looking. This is a sample of a clinic that we have a couple of years of history there at the bottom, and then you can see what happened when we reevaluated, which we do this quarterly for our clinics, is reevaluate all these charts too. But you can see with revenue that they had a 9.6% growth from 2012 to 2013. So when you're charting your data, just like we would look at it, you want to check to see, are you growing by at least 10%? I know national average is a whole lot less than that, but you want to be a healthy practice, right? So you want to try and achieve at least 10%. Our clinics generally get 16 to 18%, some of them up to 20%, and that's in the mid-range. Certainly there's clinics that, some of our rescue programs basically, that are quite a bit higher than that. But, you can see for this particular clinic, that they went up 15.7% that next year. So we can kind of see how the history adapted as they started putting in some new plans that we helped them to implement. We also like to do a projection chart just to kind of see how they're, what kind of course that they would be on if they kept doing those same things. But then you can see that for the next year with the 2015 here, that it really took off there. So revenue is the first layer. That's the main layer. Then you want to break it apart and see, well, what contributed to revenue. There's the transactions, who's walking through the door, preferably pets walking through the door because that's where production comes from. And then there's also the component of what's the average charge, okay? And it's very important that those two things be in balance because using the same one as our case study here, you can see again, just based on their history, they actually lost 7.8%. They went down that much on their transactions. So if they had gone up 9.6%, you know that all that growth came from having to raise their ACT, whether they intended to or kind of by default, because sometimes what happens is when a clinic gets slower, like in the case here, went down 7.8% on transactions, then there's a kind of a compensation of maybe it comes from having more time to do things, but the average charge goes up. And so that's where they were able to recover it. Is that sustainable, though? If you don't have balance between these two things, it certainly may not be. You want your revenue to come from an increase on both of them. And it's very important that you focus first on transactions, get that stable while you keep your ACT from dropping, and then you can grow both of them from there. Okay, and you can see we help them to recover on their transactions, and again, just shot right up there, and doing very well with their transactions now.
Well, let me make a comment here that for management, practice ownership management, that in this practice, when we saw this occurring, the first question we asked is, are you prepared for more business? And everyone wants more business, more revenue, so on and so forth. But, you've got to know as management, are you prepared to handle it? And one of the clients I had dealing with yesterday said, we have no open slots in our schedule. And we help them to grow substantially. But then the issue becomes, if we know this is going to happen, how are we going to accommodate it? So just a side point, Kim.
Well, no, it's a really good point because you want to be able to grow and also look at the other protocols and systems you have in place to make sure that you can handle it. You don't want to grow in one place and then drop in the other. You want both to be going up. Something else to think about is the fluctuation from month to month that's happening with your transactions. And, there certainly could be some seasonality that's part of that, but we want to look at how true is that situation, if that's the case for you. Is it also because you don't have good systems in place to make sure people are bringing their pet through the door? Why would you have so much of a fluctuation in the transactions? This is a pretty good drop that this one is showing here. And when you don't have control or stability to your transactions, it makes it really difficult to properly manage and plan for your staffing and your inventory. Okay, so the goal, that's why I said, is to get stability to your transactions within the month and then from month to month. And that becomes sustainable, and then that's something to grow off of. So looking at your fluctuation pattern in there is also important. I'm going to go through this one really quickly. It's a totally different clinic, but it will come up again at the very end. If we have time, I'm going to do a really quick little case study. But this is a clinic that you can see has really extreme fluctuation in their transactions, and definitely some degree of seasonality was part of it, but that's way too much fluctuation, and it was really having an impact on them. So that's something that had to get addressed for sure with them. You want to consider for yourself if this is something that you're experiencing. So the other component to the revenue is the ACT, the average charge per transaction. And I just took the little snapshot here on the ACT because we already talked about the balance between ACT and transactions. But you want to look at how much of a swing there is, because you really should have pretty consistent ACT when you think about it. When you, using the scenario I talked about before, if it gets really busy, well, then the ACT might go down. And if it gets really slow, like in the case of this clinic, the ACT had a tendency to go up, right? But if you can create that balance between both, then you can have a very predictable kind of ACT. And again, that's something you can grow off of. Because if it bounces around too much, then it's kind of like, well, where is it going? What kind of protocols do we have in place? Part of what we're going to talk about today in the evaluation, the exploratory analysis, is also looking at things like your code structure, your estimate structure, your fee structure. Lots of things, including staffing, can have an effect on this swing. And you can see in the history for this particular clinic that they had a $22 swing, which is already more than the 10 that we're striving for. And then when they got slower, it had even more of a swing. It just showed that it really was kind of a false revenue increase. Even though the revenue went up, it came from this very unpredictable ACT going up and down and up and down. So it's going to be really hard for them if they continued like this to be able to hold on to that. New clients would be the other chart that you would want to, look at. Now, I think it's important to look at it as a relationship to the transactions that you have, because if it's getting busier, then you expect the new clients to go up as well. And if it's slower, then the new client should be a proportion of that too, right? So in the history on this particular clinic, kind of right in the middle of where I've got the rename button there, they were actually a pretty healthy practice again at 6.3%. We're shooting for about 6.5% of the transactions coming from new clients. And if you're looking at it, are you at 6.5%? Honestly, most of our practices that we see when they start with us are at about 3 to 3.5%. And we help them to put some measures in place that do not cost more money. That's important. I mean, you can obviously spend money on marketing, but we focus on some things that can really help to grow new client base without adding more of a cost to the whole system. And in this case, even though they were already healthy for that average example there at 6.3%, they actually went up to 8.1%. So that's really nice increase for them. Really helps to counter attrition. Okay, now we're going to get into a different kind of historical charting. These are going to be what we call our analytics, or the bar charts. And we want to look first at category and how the categories perform relative to each other. And then we're going to look at some core categories. We're going to take them apart, especially exam category, to see how the treatment items perform. And that's where looking at the quantity or the frequency of the treatments within that category can be very helpful. So Scott's going to walk you through each of these. And of course, if you have your download, you already have this information on your guide already, okay, explaining about why the analytic charts are important. And so we'll start here on revenue by category. Scott?
Yeah, that what the exploratory analysis does, and what we advise you to do with us or on your own, is to diagnose a situation. And to diagnosing that situation, means looking at where you're producing revenue. Not only between, that categories, which is the base level to start at. And we can see Kim's screen again. Kind of lost it there for a moment. But the idea is that to look at, again, going back historically, to be able to look at your category revenue, let's say in 2013 compared to 2014, compared to where you are now, okay? And when we look at that, then that it gives you perspective, and you need to look at that to see if your current performance is relating to where you intended the practice to go. And so that as you take Avamark reports, and there's several of them that you can use, to be able to say, well, we went up in the revenue for exams, we didn't go up in the revenue for laboratory diagnostics, other diagnostics, or dentistry, what opportunity did we miss? And so all of these reports translate into, again, like I said before, here's what happened to us, what do we do next? And if it's not headed in the direction you wanted to go into, then you need to be able to change things. And so that, that's the key point of this. And so that, hang on just a second.
I apologize for
Kim,
the
can you
little,
see my,
I'm going to just really quickly try and change presenter. It's jammed up for some reason, so just 1 second. Tracy, if you could make yourself presenter and then give it back to me again. It seemed to have decided it wanted to switch to her screen for some reason.
I know, and I'm trying to switch it back to yours now, and it won't let me.
Okay, switch it to mine. Okay. So hopefully you can all see my screen now. Sometimes technology is wonderful, and sometimes it fails us, and you know that in the practice when people at times will say that I don't know what's happening. And so what you see on the screen now is what I was talking about and you can do this by output directly from your Avmark system in terms of looking at the comparisons. This happens to be a year-to-date between 2 years. And it's important to look at that every month because if you come down to, and the type is very small, but you will get a copy of this, but if you look at in this particular practice that professional services, okay, declined somewhat, okay, and in this practice, one of the things to look at is notice that their #1 category is laboratory services, okay, and that is the trend these days. AHA, AVMA, the Canadian, that are all saying we should be doing more diagnostics. And we don't make as much money on diagnostics on one hand, but it's better care of the patient on the other hand. And that's what we want to focus on, is the care of the patient. So if you take the time, if you have the time to say, here's how our production changed between categories this year to last year, then if you're a single doctor practice, it's a reminder to the single doctor. If you're a multi-doctor practice, it's a reminder to the practice of why did we or did we not do something. And those reminders are critical, as Dr. Packen would probably say, and Kim and I know, they're critical in developing the future. Is we got to know where we are to figure out where we're going to go. And so with that said, I'll go to the next one. At that point then, you can begin to take the category revenue as a general overview and begin to drill down into the elements of it. And I don't advocate, Dr. Paquin and Kim would say to me, don't try to do too much at one time, okay? And that's the whole basis of our program, is let's take an element like the quantity of exams that through this practice, it's the first 5 months of 2015 compared to 2014, and begin to selectively attack one category. And so that in this particular case, when we drill down into examinations, okay, that in this practice, and one of the things we advocate is to differentiate a well pet exam from a medical problem or sick pet exam, because the differentiation there makes a difference in terms of, again, monitoring. So if Dr. Paquin, saw my dog, and even if I came in based on a reminder, okay, but my dog has a condition, drives every doctor crazy that I responded to a reminder to get a DA2P, let's say, came in and the dog's been vomiting for 2 weeks. And, well, why didn't you bring in the dog earlier? But differentiating the well pet from the medical problem exam is critical, because in this case, you know, their physical examination / consultation is their medical problem exam. And you can see that that should lead directly into the need for a what's traditionally called a recheck, which we advocate saying should be called a medical progress exam. And you can see that of those sick pets that came in initially, only 25% had a recall or recheck / medical problem or medical progress exam. And that's significant. I mean, these are the details that produce revenue for your practice and produce, number one, they produce better patient care. And what spills out of better patient care is revenue. And so in this particular case, that what AAHA and AVMA say is that 50% of these people, you know, should be getting a medical progress exam. The question then becomes, are you proactively scheduling that exam? And so it's not just a matter of it's going to happen.
And Scott, I'm going to see if it will let me be the presenter again, so we'll check and see if it shows my screen here. Okay, I should be back on. Sorry, I'm not sure why it did that, but we'll go ahead from this screen and go to the next one that Scott had been talking about. So now we're on to looking at the examination category where we can break it up by the producer as well. So for the multi-doctor practices, there's another layer that you want to look at as the production by producer. Okay, and I'm not sure if we lost Scott on audio, so I can go ahead and speak on this. One of the things he does every month with our practices that do have multiple doctors is to go through some of these key categories. And I think it's very helpful to better understand who's doing what. Everybody, you know, has their preferences of what they want to do. It is a little bit doctor by doctor, but it also, I think, is a reflection of what your medical protocols are, and having standards of care would be very important. And that's where looking at how your estimates are organized would also be very revealing about if that might have some impact on how some of your different codes actually are producing when it varies from one doctor to the next. And keep in mind, when we're talking about a category like the examinations, that does turn into other events or other services provided as well. And so there's another area to be looking at once you look at the exam category by producer, is what's coming off of those exams. Okay. Here's just another kind of example, something interesting to look at in this particular exam category we performed on a practice is there's a brief and a routine. And when we asked the clinic about how they use each of these codes, they weren't really sure. And that's kind of an interesting topic to go through is, you know, how are people actually organizing their treatment codes and defining the use? It's the very first thing that we do with our practices after an exploratory analysis is to go through the entire treatment list, a little bit at warp speed, but making sure there's clear definition to the use of these codes. And it was pretty enlightening for this practice, especially when you have one particular doctor doing a whole lot more of something like this than something else. And what was the occurrence in this case is that that doctor, instead of charging for the full examination, was basically discounting it by just sticking them under briefs, when in fact they really were full comprehensive examinations. And so that kind of sparked some conversation as well. And I think it's really helpful to go through your treatment list to make sure that it's, you know, very clear to everybody how those codes are going to be used. Now, we talked about the exam category. There are some other categories to look at as well. if there's professional services related to the exams. Sometimes people put exams all together in the professional services category. Sometimes they break it apart, but definitely the related treatment items that would be there. Vaccinations is an interesting one, especially because there's so many changes happening with the client perception of value on vaccinations, and of course there's changing vaccine protocol. But how are those related to the exams? Dental is one we really like to look at because it's one of those where there's just so much room to capture more dentals for practices. And so understanding in your history where you are with your dentistry, dental as a category, and then dental by the individual treatment codes within that category is really important to look at. Sometimes it's the extractions we notice there's room for increasing extractions. Most of the time it's room for increasing the dental treatments themselves. Hospitalization, labs. Some clinics will break up inside and outside. Sometimes they put them all together, and sometimes we find that they put them in 4, 5, 6 different categories. So just depends on how you set it up, how it's going to have to get looked at. Sometimes people like to compare inside and outside when they're trying to determine which way that they really want to go with performing their lab too. And radiology is a good one to look at. It has a tendency to fluctuate a lot for practices and unfortunately be a little bit on a decline for some practices too. So that's another core category to look at. So basically you've gone through your history, okay, when you've this far into the exploratory analysis. You've looked at how revenue and its contributing factors has been trending over the years here. And then you're also looking at how are the categories and the treatment items performing and looking at correlations in there. And now it's time to look at how are your reminders set up and how are you actually processing them, because that's what gets the animals through the door. When Scott was showing you about the exams, he was also talking about the distribution of the medical problem visit to the well visit or the preventative care visit, annual visit, whatever you want to call it. And so it's really important to be focusing on that core group that we want to make sure is coming in on a consistent basis regardless of any medical condition happening. So it really starts with the reminder template. And I've never seen, honestly, a reminder template in Avamark that didn't have some sort of problem. And it's not that it's Avamark necessarily, it's just that it has so many features in there, way more advanced than most of the other software systems, that you really have to think through your own protocol and make sure it's applied properly within, within the template setup itself. And you want to think about, are your core protocols showing up? Is there something missing that's in here? There's been several times Scott and I have done an exploratory analysis and found there was no examination in the reminder setup. And then there's also a whole other discussion for clinics that don't break apart the well visit and the medical problem visit, and how that medical problem visit keeps kicking out the well visit if you have it all tied to one exam in the reminder. In Avamark, because you can have some of your codes, especially old codes you're not using anymore, do a remind as. It kind of replaces itself with whatever your new code is. You want to make sure that that's set up properly so nothing ends up getting missed. And then there's also, what a lot of people are almost afraid to get into is the more advanced type of reminders beyond your core, which gets into things like chronic medication blood work that you want to make sure that animals are coming in routinely for. So there's a lot of things that can be done, especially in the lab area, to add into the reminder setup. And there's lots of different ways of kind of manipulating reminders within Avamark, but that's one of the things we do look at in our exploratory analysis, because this is an indicator of how you're communicating with your clients. This has to be set up properly first. And then there's the processing schedule. If you have an outside party, a third-party reminder service handling it, don't just assume it's on total autopilot. Robert Levis was not able to join us today, but he's on our team, and he helps our practices with their third-party systems to make sure that they're set up right in the portal itself, because there's a lot of little nuances that can be there to make sure you're going to have the best kind of reminder processing for client compliance that you can get. But you have to check on it. You have to be sticking with that portal and engaging with it, because that's how you're going to get a whole lot better compliance out of it. So don't just send it on autopilot. You have to still be involved with it. This is just a little output from someone's third-party reminder just to kind of see what's going out and when. But that's what you want to ask yourself is, what is my schedule? I ask that question all the time of people, and they're like, I'm not really sure. Somebody knows. Well, hopefully they have some schedule, right? Start there. The next thing is, what if that somebody that knows isn't there? Goes on vacation, leaves, whatever the issue is, who's going to make sure that the plan is in place? Okay, so you want to have a real structure to how these reminders are actually getting processed. But then there's all of the conditions, like what form do you send? When do you send it, especially relative to the due date? How many times do you send it? What's the combination, special combination you should do between mail and email, text, phone call, da-da-da. There's so many questions to ask when it comes to processing. And just because a third-party system might set you up on a protocol does not necessarily mean that that would be what results in the greatest compliance. So that's part of what we like to look at too, just at least generally in an exploratory analysis, but very deeply when we actually work with a client, because this can have the greatest impact on creating stability with your transactions. And that's why it's really important to be able to monitor the compliance and ask yourself if you are monitoring it and if you know what your compliance rate is, and don't just take a third-party system's numbers to be what the actual compliance is. It needs to be, what did you send out versus what came in truly. Okay, not any other factors in there, just very clean. Did they respond? Did they come in to get what they needed? When you do these steps, especially with the reminders, this is what your charts can actually look like. This is really beautiful as far as transactions go. It's really stable, and then after a while we actually got them to take another big jump up on their transactions. But you want to really look at the stability, because that in the growth pattern, because that's what you're going to be building off of. What you create today builds for next year too. Okay, next step. I know there's a lot of steps to this exploratory analysis, but you can see that this is not an easy process to go through, but it's really necessary so you get the big picture of how your practice is performing, because you have to get all this information before you can create that plan for success. So look at your treatment item setup report. Like I said, we go through the entire report with you if you wanted us to help you with it, to see how things are organized and defined and used, and we look at general fee structure that's in there, and also the estimate. So I have a quick little slide here on, a sample of somebody's estimate report. Now, when we get the printout, basically we push it through Excel, but the report does come out in alphabetical order. When we specifically look at estimates within the system with a client, we do open it up right in the screen, because it's the best way to see, or that they produce an estimate, which, by the way, is modifiable if you're not using that feature. But you want to look at the order of the treatments that are in inventory items that are inside of there, because it needs to be something that the client can follow along with. So we do recommend chronological order. And all the time I find that these estimates don't have a pre-surgical exam. That's something that you want to make sure that you have in your surgical estimates and have it in the first position. And if you want to talk about why, just give me a call. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. When you have estimates that are related to each other, this example is just one dental, but if you had different types of dentals, like you did it by stages, then you have to make sure that if you make a change in one estimate, that you change it in the others as well. So that might be something that needs to be looked at. So when I go through the estimate list, I like to see what estimates are actually created in here. I talk to the client too about what is being used and how they're being used, and really getting a better understanding, because this is what helps to create some standardization of the medical protocols. And I think it's really important when you have multiple doctors to have some of these things set up, and it's certainly good for time efficiency as well. So after the whole overview of everything that's in your system and how you're using it, Then it's time to, come up with that plan and be able to monitor. You have to monitor in real time, because otherwise it will always be historical, and you'll just look back at the past as like, oh yeah, remember that day, or remember that month, or ooh, that was good, that was bad. But you can't do anything about the past. You can do something about the present. So if you're tracking and you're watching for trends in the current time, then you can do something about it. For instance, a transaction trend can get away from you within 3 days. All of a sudden, boom, it drops. And if you don't do something about it, it will continue to drop, or it will stay dropped, and you won't be able to recover it. You can't just hope that people walk through the door. There's tools that you need and steps that you need to put in place, and that's part of your plan to get them through the door when you want them to come through the door. So you've got to watch your real-time trends. Watch the balance. Like I said before, if that clinic had been watching their transactions drop and their ACT skyrocket, then they should have said, oh my gosh, we're out of balance. We need to do something about this. And that's why the real time is so important to monitor. This is just a quick little snapshot of something that we use. We're actually converting it right now into an electronic web app format. But it's so important to be able to really track in real time, like how are you progressing compared to how it's projected where you're going to be, and how it's comparing to the past, to your history, okay, and watching those trends. So in your plan for success, if you've identified what's happened in the past, looked at those fluctuations, looked at the relationships of everything that kind of brought all of these numbers together, then your plan comes from there. It's like, how can we readdress some of these issues so we can get the revenue to go up with balance in transactions and balance in ACT, and from there it's sustainable growth. Now, this is just a little snapshot of some of the areas that we focus on with our clinics, so you can see what you might do for your plan, or we can help you with the plan, but definitely starting with your treatment list, getting that cleaned up. You would not believe what that does to help practices. There has been a couple of times we've actually found that, especially with multiple doctors, that not everybody was on the same page with how codes get used. And in the example I'm using here, that there was a split in doctors thinking anesthesia was included in surgery or not included in surgery, and they had to add it on. So in half of those events, nobody charged for anesthesia, and it was supposed to be a separate code being entered. And that stuff happens. So that's what needs to definitely be looked at. You can have immediate change happen with going through the treatment list. The reminder module absolutely helps with transaction stability, and you can spend some time going through the different areas that we look at with our practices, but it's always in an order that's appropriate for the practice. In your plan, you want to prioritize what's most important to address first, and then we go on down the list, because we want to impact now, we want to impact for the future, and we want to work on our efficiencies. So ask yourself this question, since you've had your download document, hopefully you were able to get with the questions you want to look at for yourself. But what do you do with your data right now? Okay, getting the history and looking at real time is very important. It's part of your plan. Okay, so I've got this case study. I'm going to just spend a quick little minute going through here, and then we'll get to kind of the summary on the exploratory analysis. But this is just a case study on a clinic that specifically had a real problem with their transactions, and I had shown you a little snapshot earlier of their chart, and I'll show it to you again. But in their baseline, what we found in a small practice, it's okay. These things work for any size practice, small or big. Okay, we work with very small one-doctor practices to multiple doctor practices. Okay, but figuring out where they're at. In this case, the clinic had zero growth in their revenue and very low transactions. And the transactions were actually on a decline, which means they're going to project for going down even further next year. Something had to be done. And so when we put the reminder module in place, because we could see what their holes were, which included their reminder template and their processing schedule, then their compliance actually went over 60%. Remember, that was one of the questions on your worksheet guide, is try to get it over 60%. They got up to 72%. And what it translated into was that their overall revenue just from those steps went up 22.5%. It was a really huge difference for them. And you can see where their this is where they were projecting to end up with their transactions, and this is where they actually ended up, and it continued to go kind of up in this direction after that. So we could create an immediate jump up, especially with the processing schedule once the template got cleaned up. So you can see how important the transactions related to your reminders is. And again, in balance with your ACT, and watch that ACT swing. So it's a lot of steps, I know, to go through and perform an exploratory analysis. It starts with generating all of those reports. But we're showing you exactly what it is we do in the event that you want to try to do it for yourself. So you produce those reports, just like Scott talked to you about in the very beginning, convert them to Excel. It's going to take some manipulation in Excel, but you can kind of organize them, and then you can create charts and bar graphs and things like that out of them, just like we do. You can look at your reminder template and your treatment list and your estimates and all of those things. You need to get the big picture. So whether you do it or we can do it for you, you want to take that action step because you came on and spent this hour with us for a reason. I would assume it's because you want to create some positive change at your practice, and it starts with getting that baseline. And understand that there is a cost of waiting. The longer you wait to do your exploratory analysis and do something about it, put that plan for success in place, the more it's going to cost you. Because even if it's just looking at national growth of 3%, if you're, let's say, just using the example of a $60,000 a month practice, that comes out to $1,500 a month you could grow it by. Do you want to wait to capture an extra $1,500 a month? I'm sure that money could go somewhere. And just using our average of 16 to 18% there for our clinics growing, that translates to $10,200 a month if you do it based on this size clinic. So maybe you're a little bit smaller clinic, maybe you're a much larger clinic. It is a ratio, so it really does project whatever size you are, that this is the kind of growth that you can experience, but it means you have to take the steps, do something about it and get that exploratory analysis done, whether you do it or we do it for you. Okay, and because we do really appreciate you coming on today and spending this time with us and hopefully, putting some of these steps in place, we are going to discount our exploratory analysis price for you. It's normally $550, and we will do it for you for $275, which is basically really, really cheap when you think about how much time it takes to put all of this stuff together. But it's all the reports, and we put a whole presentation book basically together for you, and then spend about an hour and a half presenting our findings for you so you really understand what's happening at your practice. And so we do hope that you take advantage of it. And one of the things that you could do when you end this webinar here is there's some survey questions you can put in there if you wanted us to follow up with you to either answer questions or do the exploratory for you, whatever you want. You can also go to visit calendly.com/kimfish, and basically it feeds off my Google Calendar so you can see where there might be an opening, and I would be happy to call you back and we could talk about what your needs might be and follow up that way. Or you can email or call Tracy and she can help organize. So whatever works for you, but we are definitely here in the background to help you as much as you would like that assistance. And otherwise, we do really hope that you get that exploratory analysis done for yourself one way or the other. And if you have any questions at this point, we would be happy to answer them. And I don't know if Scott has his audio back on yet, but I know that we've got Dr. Paquin on here, and he would be able to answer some questions too for you. So if you don't have any questions, that's fine. You might think of some things later, and you can always get in touch with us. Okay.
Well, and that Dr. Paquin, you're there, and the key thing is if you want to make change, you have to start today, and that you could make change, just by reflecting on your operations. And even looking at yesterday, you can make changes for tomorrow. And so that's my key point. Doc, anything?
Yeah, so just quick on my background. I've owned a couple practices, and I've done relief in Arizona for probably 4 or 5 years, and I start to realize that Avamart tends to just really be, for a lot of clinics, a point of sales, and some doctors will look at their ACT, but that's typically about it. And if I ask these doctors, how many new clients are you seeing per month and things of that nature, a lot of them really don't know because they're busy, understandably so. And so What the exploratory analysis does is a global perspective of each individual practice. Look at the strengths, look at the weaknesses. A lot of times there's so many variables that are placed on each of these. For instance, when we talk about the medical exam, the progress exam, and this particular practice was at 25%. You know, why is that? Does there need to be a cultural change? Does there need to be a staff meeting? Are we just telling the client to go up front and tell the front desk receptionist, Dr. X told me to recheck in 2 weeks? Well, maybe that system's not working, and maybe we need to sit down and discuss and employ other avenues. Commonly, I see the reminder, I call it low-hanging fruit. So a lot of practices will zero in on the task at hand or the problem at hand. Let's say as simple as an ear infection, and we'll miss the preventative care. And so it's things like that that we can analyze, and then we got to ask the why is that happening, and then the how do we remedy this? And a lot of this, as Scott alluded to, that we can't make these changes overnight. It's a gradual change, and so if there's 15 issues we feel we want to work on, let's grab the first 2 at hand. And then usually, again, it's going to require a cultural change and shift, and that starts with the owners and it starts with the practice managers. And then we integrate that with the staff at hand and, again, explain the why we want to do it. At the end of the day, I think we can all agree, excellent patient care, great client service equals profitability. We don't have to switch that equation around. And really, this is what this analysis does for us. Allows us to provide better patient care, better client service, and ultimately a profitable practice.
That was a great summary. Thank you, Dr. Packman. And Dr. Packman can certainly be part of the exploratory analysis for you guys as well. So just let us know how we can help, and we hope that you participate with future webinars with us. And you will be getting a follow-up email here. I think it'll come out probably tomorrow, but it'll have a link to this recorded webinar so that you can re-access it and go through it again, or even share it with other people at your practice. So thank you very much for spending this hour with us, and we hope to hear from you again soon. Thank you. Have a great day.